We're about to talk to the vice presidential nominee for the Libertarian Party. This should be good. So we met at LibertyCon, and we were going to talk, but then I had to be whisked away because it was my time to speak at LibertyCon. I really wanted to talk to you because I was interested in talking to you about your video that you published on Ukraine right after the invasion happened, because you did something that I really respect, and that was you originally definitely stated that Russia would not invade Ukraine, and you compared it to
no, I did not think they would.
You were very definite in that assertion as well, but then once it happened, you kind of retraced your steps and you explained why you got it wrong and laid out your framework for that. First off, why did you release that video explaining that away? And I'm getting right into it, but I know where I have somewhat of a time limit. Why did you release that video? Why do you think it was important to release?
I released that video for the same reason I typically will release things like that when I get something big wrong, because if I get something wrong, I have a prominent enough platform that a lot of people are seeing what I've said, and I speak at least somewhat for a greater movement and a party to some extent. And so if I get something wrong, I need to say that I got it wrong, and to explain how I got there, and go from there. I'm not a fan of people who will make some bold proclamation and then get it completely wrong and then just pretend it never happened. That might be the best way to build a base of support, by never admitting you're wrong, but it's not my style. And just to make it clear, when I made the video, I started with, for those who didn't see it, I started with the reasons why I got it wrong, why I didn't think they'd invade. And the number one reason I thought they wouldn't invade is because the U.S. government said they would. There's that old phrase, a broken clock is right twice a day. It turns out that a lying clock is right every 30, 40 years or so. And then the other reason I didn't think they would do it is because I thought it would end largely, or go largely, the way it is. I didn't think it would be easy. I thought it would be a slog. I thought it would lead to international condemnation and sanctions. I thought it would be, I did not think that. I suspected that Russia's military was every bit the paper tiger that the U.S. military has proven to be. And so it kind of is playing out to some extent. I'm no military expert, but certainly I thought it would be a slog, and I thought it would be devastating to the Russian economy and standing in the world. So, but I was wrong. They did do it.
So you said your primary motivator for why you thought that this wouldn't happen was because you thought that the assertion that the government was making was, well, the government, has been dishonest before when it comes to like WMDs, Gulf of Tonkin, something along those lines, and therefore this time they're probably lying as well. Is this something that you're gonna adjust about your thinking moving forward? Like if the United States said tomorrow that country A looks like they're preparing to invade country B, would you take that a lot more seriously in the future? Because a lot of people have this problem. I know a lot of people who was just like, America said it, so I don't believe it. And a lot, like Hassan Abi was another person who did it, and a very popular content creator. Other people did that. How would you adjust going forward to stop yourself kind of landing into somewhat reactionary response to the government saying?
Yeah, so I mean, generally speaking, obviously, I have to take that into account, right? I will say in general, as a general rule of thumb, if the U.S. government, or really any major government, says something, more often than not, you can safely bet that it's not true. This was a blind spot on my part, and I admit to that. So I mean, if the fact that they have said something shouldn't weigh in as immediately as me saying, okay, that's not going to happen. I mean, that, and I said that in the video, so absolutely.
Do you think that that's a good framework to work off of, though, the idea that, well, the government says something that's probably not true? When, the government's involved in a lot of disaster responses, involved in a lot of responses to invasions and wars and conflicts and famines like this. Do you think that's a safe framework to just be like, on default, you should probably just not trust the government when they make a statement?
On default, you should probably not trust the government when they make a statement. That doesn't mean there aren't exceptions to it. And my not immediately trusting the government I learned from this, one thing I did learn from this is that yes, by default, you cannot trust the government, and that's usually a safe bet and a good way to go. But it doesn't mean that you should just dismiss it outright. You can still continue doing, looking into it and determining it for yourself. But no, I mean, the reality is you can measure the things that and this isn't specific to the U.S. government, the bigger and more powerful a government is, and the more centralized its authority is, and the more power it has, and therefore the less accountability it has, the more it can just outright lie us into wars and genocides and, all sorts of terrible things. So, generally speaking, if you weigh the things that they say that are true against the things they say that aren't true, it is, widely outnumbered the things that are untrue. But that doesn't mean that you should just assume and disregarding any other information that what they said wasn't true.
I guess for me, my main concern when I engage in that type of thinking isn't that I don't want anybody to be skeptical if the government makes an extreme claim or a claim that obviously needs substantive proof. I want the government to provide proof for those claims. But I think if we start from the position of just don't trust the government, then there's going to have to be a lot of there's going to be a lot of people who just jump to conclusions, as you did when it came to this war, as Hassan Abi did, as many people did. I'm not saying you're alone when it came, or one of many people who jumped to this. And I think if we keep that framework, there's a risk that we could lead to that very same thinking about possibly another war in the future, a natural disaster, or an incoming economic or medical crisis.
Yeah, no, I think I've already said this. Yeah, I would say I agree with that. If I will still say again, generally speaking, the government and here's a blind spot I had. I was so focused on the U.S. government is a liar. Well, so was the Russian government. And I thought, well, why would the Russian government do this? It's stupid. It's going to end well for them. That would be a foolish thing. Well, but that's true of every bit of adventurism that the U.S. government has gotten into. So here I was, almost sort of like a home court advantage. I'm sitting here saying, oh, the U.S. government's lying and the Russian government wouldn't do something so foolish. Well, flip that around. The Russian government is lying and they did do something so foolish.
So at the time, and I'm not just going to talk about Ukraine this whole talk. I do want to move on to topics that we probably agree on. I just want to make sure I get that out of the way because my audience would kill me if I didn't. At the time in the video, you said that continued or escalating U.S. intervention is only going to make the situation in Ukraine. You said that about 10 months ago. Do you still stand by that claim that American intervention would just make the situation worse?
Yes, and not just in Ukraine. I mean, keep in mind, and I want to clarify a couple things because I don't know how long you want to talk about this, so I want to make sure I make a couple key points.
Take as much time as you need.
I believe that Russia is unequivocally the aggressor here. Even if you factor in the back and forth pissing contest that NATO and its allies and Russia and its allies have been doing in that region for quite some time, even if you factor in any of the corruption or provocations that have happened on the Western side, any of that, in the same way that, I used in that video the analogy of what if in order to respond to U.S. aggression in Latin America, China and Russia formed with a SATO, a South American treaty organization that started in, just parts of Central and South America and ended up expanding to the point that there were missiles in Mexico and Canada pointed at the U.S. But even still in that situation, if the U.S. responded by invading Mexico or invading Canada, the U.S. would still unequivocally be the aggressor there. So in that, applying that to this, Russia is still the aggressor there. So I just want to make that clear. But in general, the more money, power, weaponry, and just generally authority and stuff, for lack of a better word, that we give to the U.S. military-industrial complex, the more harm is going to be done around the world. You look at this invasion, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. At last I saw something like, I believe, around 7,000 Ukrainian civilians have been killed. And that's absolutely devastating. I mean, you put that in perspective with something like a 9/11, that's almost triple the number of people killed on 9/11. In Iraq, something like 300,000 civilians were killed in the U.S. invasion of Iraq. 10,000 alone were killed in a roughly 1 month period during the so-called shock and awe campaign. In Afghanistan, 35,000 civilians were killed there. In Yemen, they call it a Yemen war. I call it a massacre, where the U.S. government is funding the Saudi government and al-Qaeda, which is technically an act of treason, to carry out what increasingly looked like a genocide against the Yemeni people, anywhere from, depending on the low estimates, around 100 to 150,000 civilians civilians died, and as high as, I think the highest number I saw was 377,000 civilians, a disproportionately large number of which are children, have been killed in that. When it comes to who is the biggest aggressor in the world, the U.S. government, by orders of magnitude, is the worst on the block. So while it may benefit the Ukrainian people to have that involvement, have U.S. involvement, I would say that when you couple first of all, the potential for escalation just in that conflict by getting the U.S. more involved, and also just the fact that the more you give the U.S. military and industrial complex, the more tens or even hundreds of thousands of civilians around the world will die. I do not believe, I do not support anyone robbing me or anyone I care about to finance war and conflict.
I agree with you about your critiques towards, say, the Iraq War intervention in Yemen. I guess the first thing I would say is the 7,000 number. I think you're probably working off UN estimates, where the 300,000 number that you're talking about is not UN estimates. UN estimates on Iraqi war deaths, I think, is actually below that. Like the violent deaths of 2006 was like something where 150,000, 200,000. The numbers that I am more seeing from other organizations outside the UN, which has to more physically kind of confirm these deaths, we're talking about like 50,000 to 150 to 200,000. It's very, the range of deaths in Ukraine is very on a much bigger range, and more people have died in a shorter period of time in Ukraine than they did in the Iraq War. I think in large part that has to, for example, the war in Ukraine's only been going on for about 10 to 11 months, while the war in Iraq, when we reached 150 to 200,000 deaths, it was about like 3 to 4 to 5 years of occupation, right? Plus the Iraq War. So we're seeing people die at a faster rate.
The one thing I will say is that if you look at the bulk of those deaths were happening during the first year or so period of invasion. And yes, you can find numbers that say Ukrainian civilians deaths were much higher, or that Iraqi civilian deaths were lower. But the reality is we're looking at lots of people that are being killed. And in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Yemen, I didn't even mention Syria or Libya or Somalia, which is actually the U.S.'s longest running foreign military intervention is in Somalia.
Of course, it's just I think the word seven, I just think the number 7,000 is kind of underplaying the amount of violence and death that has happened in Ukraine.
That's fair. So let's say it's 100,000, which makes it exponentially more devastating. Again, I'm not doing this to trivialize the Russian invasion or the devastating harm that's being done there. What I'm saying is that the U.S. is at the very least an equal, and I would argue a much greater aggressor in the world. I don't have any power or any ability to affect change in Russia. If the Russian government were advocating to tax or rob me and others here to finance what's happening on their side over there, I would oppose it every bit as much. And I do oppose what they're doing there. But here, as a citizen of the United States, I oppose continued growth of the U.S. military-industrial complex, which is responsible for far more civilians killed around the globe than what Russia has done.
I guess it's just, in the video you said that American intervention will only make the situation worse. But when I see the amount of military and humanitarian aid the United States has sent Ukraine, it has been tremendously helpful in their retaking of locations like Kherson, which has reunited tens of thousands of families, the retaking of Kupiansk, and the liberation of over 50% of the territory that Russia has captured since February, when they started the large-scale invasion. It has been essential for a lot of these counteroffensives and bringing them the successes that they've had. So I think that is making the situation better. More liberated land is better, more Ukrainian families reunited is better, and more Ukrainian victories is better for the country, as most Ukrainians will attest to, and most Ukrainians want the aid. So I fail to see how it makes the situation in Ukraine worse in any way.
Because it's not just that one thing that's happening. As with all of these things, when you give billions of dollars more to the Pentagon and to its ancillaries, that doesn't just grow this effort in Ukraine. But even if you look at just this effort in Ukraine, we're looking at this from this very moment. I remember watching the invasion of Iraq or the invasion of Afghanistan back in the early 2000s and seeing the early reports that, that the invasion was going swimmingly, and that in some places, especially in Iraq, we were being greeted as liberators, and the terrorists were falling by the wayside, and the Saddam Fedayeen, which used to be the Iraqi military, was on the run. And over the years, what what turned out was that we were lied to, that things were not going the way that we were being told they were going, that the picture was a lot more muddled and nuanced. And I'm not, even if that isn't what's happening, even if everything we're being told in Ukraine is exactly what's happening, even if that's the case, I'm still against it because it is still leading to the empowerment of the biggest murder machine in human history. But I also, looking at the history of what we are told about being lied to go into war and to continue involvement in war, I can't help but think that we are potentially creating problems for the future that are hard to foresee now. An example of that, I remember seeing, this was probably a couple months ago now, you probably know a lot more details on this. There was a report that I don't forget if it was the Russian government or the Wagner group, I forget which one, possibly both, were hiring Afghan mercenaries to fight in Ukraine against the Ukrainian people. Well, those Afghan mercenaries were originally trained by the U.S. military to be part of the so-called Afghan National Army. And when that crumbled by the wayside and the Afghanistan was retaken by the Taliban, they're now guns for hire. So I looking at the pattern of what happens with U.S. military involvement, and frankly, not just U.S. military involvement, but these large military involvements, is that it doesn't just end there. Now, if I were a Ukrainian person where my immediate concern is the safety of myself and my neighbors and loved ones, I would probably have a lot less nuanced of a take on this. I will absolutely admit to that. But from where I am, and from looking at the history of U.S. military adventurism here and abroad, I'm not going to support anything other than a retraction of U.S. military forces around the globe.
I would first say that I think the reporting in Iraq and about what was going on in Iraq and the reporting in Ukraine, what was going on in Ukraine, is a little different for the fact that how Ukraine treats media is a lot different than how media was treated in Saddam's Iraq, and the type of reporting that could be done freely on the ground, I think, is a lot more expansive in Ukraine. From my personal experience, at least. Somebody else, maybe like Gonzalo Lira, might disagree with me, but from my personal experience, that is what I interacted with. Now, some of this...
I want to ask you something. This isn't a gotcha question because I don't know the details of it. I know that there was recently some kind of media law that was passed in Ukraine. A lot of media have come out condemning it or talking
I disagree with
about
it too.
Does that...
I disagree with it too.
I don't know much about it. Does that change things there?
I don't think it changes it to a significant degree enough that it would tilt my view of the war when it comes to media freedom, or tilt my view in the war in the amount of reporting I could do. Honestly, it's probably going to have a much bigger impact on larger media organizations than independent freelance reporter, which I am. So it's not really going to have much of an impact on the type of reporting I can do or the type of experiences I've had that has recertified a lot of the war crimes that I've either personally reported on or personally experienced that showed me that, yes, civilians are being targeted. Yes, there was a massacre at Bucha. Yes, these things happened. Now, there is an information war. Like in any war, the information is part of the conflict. And I'm sure after the war, there'll be some things that were probably shown to be not true that we thought was true at the time. Definitely in the age of social media, where a lot of information is just thrown out there and unvetted. I've seen reports about like Ukrainian weapons in Venezuela that just like ended up not being true because people just like took a blurry photo and took it from an angle. That can be the case, but I've yet to see a substantive pushback on the main crimes that Russia has committed as like evidence that the Russians have pushed back against it. Like what happened at Bucha, what happened at Izium, or the deliberate targeting of civilians that the Russian government has participated in. So I will say that there's probably going to be some stuff after the war is over that was shown to be untrue, definitely stuff on social media, but I still think the bulk of the crimes that Russia is accused of is probably true. That isn't to say Ukraine hasn't accused any crimes themselves, but Russia just has more ability to do crimes, period. They have more artillery guns. They have, they're occupying land. There's not really much of an opportunity for like Ukrainians to go into Russia and to do the type of stuff that Russia. When it comes to
if only because they don't have the capability. I understand.
If only because of that. I would like to think that they wouldn't, but different scenario, I don't know, right? As for the idea that we are empowering the war machine here, the war machine we have and the weapons we have, whether they were garnered through moral means or have been used in moral means in the past, are tools to accomplish a task. Whether that task is winning a just war or an unjust war depends on your perspective. I think the Ukrainians are fighting a just war in self-defense. And there's not really any other means the Ukrainians can pull from internationally for them to be able to fight what is, in my opinion, a just war. And from everything I've heard from you talking about Ukraine, you think the Ukrainians obviously have a right to defend themselves. I think most libertarians would think that, even if sometimes the New Hampshire branch gets a little edgy on the internet. So I think you say it's going to empower the war machine. Would your advice be basically, well, until we have a completely moral system to deal with this internationally, until the UN or some other organization has a more moral system, we just basically just say, not our business, not our problem. If it happens, it happens. It's kind of tough shit.
I wouldn't phrase it that way. The way I would phrase it is that, no, I know you were. But here's what I would say. If instead we were talking about the situation in Yemen, and we're talking to people in Yemen who are begging foreign countries to get involved and to stop, to fight against the efforts that are happening in Yemen. And obviously, a lot of this is hypothetical because a lot of this free exchange of ideas isn't allowed in a place like Russia. But if it were, a Russian, everyday Russian civilian could say, well, they could be in my position of saying, well, I don't support this because if we're empowering the Russian military industrial complex, even if for this thing, which is to try to stop or ostensibly stop the killings of hundreds of thousands of more civilians or even millions of civilians, it's also going to lead to them to be able to do things like what they're doing in Ukraine, or even other things, even worse things, getting even more involved in invading other Eastern Bloc countries. And so I can't morally support that. And many people would look at that person and go, oh, you selfish bastard. Here you are in Russia, and all you're thinking about is Russia and Eastern Europe, and meanwhile, hundreds of thousands of civilians are dying. And the calculation that many people are making, and that's why Russia has so much support in the global south, the so-called third world, is because when they look at Russia versus the United States, they see the United States, who has been all in their countries, invading and bombing and destabilizing and doing all sorts of terrible things, and they see Russia, who has done much less of that to a much lesser extent. And so when the calculation they're making, even if they don't support the Ukrainian war, the invasion of Ukraine, or even have much of an opinion on it, they're still going to side with Russia, China, and the BRICS alliance over U.S. and the liberal democratic West, because they see the U.S. and the liberal democratic West as their most immediate threat. So from my standpoint, when I'm saying I'm against U.S. military involvement, I'm not saying it from the standpoint of because I think Russia's better. I would say in this case, if you have to pick the worst bad guy, if there is such a thing, Russia's the worst bad guy. But generally speaking, it's at the very least arguable which one is the worst bad guy. I would argue that just in terms of sheer body count, that the U.S. doesn't have a peer. Sort of like how you were saying, if only because they have the biggest industrial complex, they have the most tools, and they have the most money to spend on it, they're the biggest mass murderer in recent history. And so for that reason, I can't support the expansion of that thing. And in the same way that might seem like I'm being callous to the Ukrainian people, the same way that a Russian opposing Russian involvement in Yemen might seem callous to the Yemen people, I'm ultimately doing it because I see that the vast majority, that far more harm is going to be done long-term and even medium-term by further empowering the U.S. military-industrial complex than by continuing to advocate for its dismantling and for ending wars overseas, ending foreign involvement, and bringing the troops back. One more point that I'd make on this is that in Ukraine, I don't believe this would have been an issue. We would have never faced the invasion of Crimea would have never happened. Certainly this invasion would have never happened if the Budapest Memorandum wouldn't happen. You probably know just as well as me, at one point, Ukraine had the third largest nuclear arsenal on Earth. And so what happens? The two countries most likely to invade or destabilize or otherwise harm Ukraine come to Ukraine and say, hey, listen, take your nukes, give them back to Russia or give them to Russia. In exchange, we'll give you a piece of paper that promises that we'll never invade you. And if either of us invade you, then the other one will come and protect you. And that's the Budapest Memorandum. And so a perfect example of U.S. government and military and diplomatic involvement leads to these types of things happening in the same way that Russian involvement does. So I'm not going to support any military industrial complex, including my own.
I think when it comes to the UN, the majority or like the majority of nations, and those in the global south as well, the majority of nations have time and time again when it comes to vote, have voted either to condemn the Russian invasion or to condemn Vladimir Putin or condemn Russia. And anytime a vote comes up and it's like a moral question of, is Russia in the right or is Ukraine in the right? And that includes those countries in the global south. I will say that certain countries like Venezuela, North Korea, Eritrea, Syria, and some other countries will vote with Russia, but it's usually a list of countries of like 5 to 8 people. The worst you'll usually see in the global south is abstentions. So if the worst you can find is an abstention, unless it's like Bashar al-Assad Syria, which is directly reliant on the Russians to prop up his government against Syrian revolutionaries and jihadists and other groups, the SDF, or North Korea, I understand that there are some countries that are not friendly with the United States, but it tends to be the worst human rights abusers in the world that are with Russia in the invasion.
Yeah,
and the best.
And to be clear, I wasn't claiming that the third world is backing or even neutral to Russia when it comes to the invasion of Ukraine. I'm saying that in general, generally speaking, they see the U.S. as the greater threat and the greater aggressor.
Yes.
But specific to this, yeah, no, absolutely.
But those countries, though,
by saying we're talking near universal condemnation of this action, which was part of why I didn't think Russia would do it.
Those countries, though, were able to show that nuance to be like, look, we have problems with the United States, but Ukraine obviously shouldn't be invaded here, and we should support Ukraine, and that's why they voted multiple times on the UN, not every country, but the majority of countries, to support Ukraine in these votes. And so these are countries that seem to, even though they might even see America as a bigger evil, they're able to show the nuance that we should still support Ukraine in this instance. And the military industrial complex, as many problems that come with it, is really the only tool available that Ukraine can use to stop this invasion from taking more villages, leading to more mass graves. And you can say that, look, I don't want to empower this organization. We find the world as we find it. The world is a cruel and sad place. And I do think we should move towards a better world, but why not use the tools available to you?
You could just as easily switch out Ukraine for Yemen or Iraq or Afghanistan or whatever next country U.S. is ramping up to invade. And you could just as easily switch out U.S. or the West or NATO or whatever with Russia and say, yes, listen, we're dealing with the reality that we have, but it's selfish and it's not right to wait for some utopian future where Russia isn't invading countries like Ukraine and encroaching in countries like Georgia, and just give them whatever they need to try to deal with the U.S. crimes in Yemen and to try to stop what's happening there and fight back against al-Qaeda and the Saudi government, the proxies of the U.S. war. And yes, it's very sad, the hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands or however many thousands of civilians that the Russians have killed. But if you look at it, the reality is the vast majority of the world condemns what's happening in Yemen, and therefore we need to just empower the Russian government just for this. And unfortunately, these other things are going to happen, but it is what it is.
I do think it would be a much better use of Russia's time if they were to, instead of wasting all this time and material on Ukraine, was to instead put it into helping Yemen. I do agree with that.
But if they were able to get keeping in mind that Russia is a dictatorship and so they can use the resources as they wish without having to get civilian buy-in. But if they were to use that to try to get global support around them and then have a net larger force or resources to then be able to attack Ukraine, or even if their resources were the same, to have more global, goodwill so that they'd be less likely to vote on that, would you still support that?
I wouldn't support these other operations. I would support what they would be doing in Yemen, like you can do in Ukraine. You can believe some wars are immoral, disgusting, and we should stop, and support other ones as a moral and just cause of defending yourself. I think that's perfectly plausible. I don't think it's a package deal. You do not need to endorse the invasion of Iraq to support Ukraine. I feel that's a.
Don't tell me that.
You're drawing up a zero-sum game here that doesn't exist.
It exists in actual reality. We're talking about reality. We're not talking about a hypothetical. We are talking about a real war machine that has really killed upwards of 1 million civilians in our lifetime. Like, this is an actual thing. These are the same people that are in charge. These are the same military contractors turned to defense officials, turned back to military contract heads. It's the same complex, and it's not a hypothetical. It is the reality of what we're facing. So de facto, when you are talking about empowering the U.S. military-industrial complex, or the Russian military-industrial complex, or the Chinese military-industrial complex, or any other major military-industrial complex, you are in fact talking about further empowering it to do the other things it's doing as well. Another example outside of war would be the war on drugs. I think it's great that people who are, that are dying in the opioid epidemic are, thanks to a very small part of the war on drugs, are getting access to things like fentanyl testing strips, are getting access to things like detox and rehab. They're getting access to things like Narcan. And I can sit here and say, well, yes, I don't also support all the horrific things that are happening with the war on drugs, millions of people in prison or with criminal records due to having a health problem, criminalizing addiction, creating a black market that empowers cartels here and around the globe in the same way that alcohol prohibition did, and all the other no-knock raids and civil asset forfeiture and all the other auxiliary things that happen as a result of the war on drugs. And so I don't support those, but I'm going to continue supporting this part of it, knowing that those other things will grow, because I know that in a better world, those other things wouldn't exist. The reality is this is what we're facing. And so I'm not going to support, even if there's a thing. And again, I'm doing this based on the assumption that we're not being lied to in Ukraine, or at the very least, like you said, there's no major sea change between what we're being told and what's actually happening. I'm assuming only the best when it comes to the Ukrainian government, the direct motives of the U.S. government in Ukraine, and everything else related to that. In net, the net harm is still going to be larger by further empowering the U.S. military-industrial complex. And again, any argument you want to make for growing the U.S. military-industrial complex, which will use that growth in places like Yemen, in places like Afghanistan, in places like Iraq, would be exactly the same as advocating for the Russian government to be further empowered to do things like this in Yemen, knowing that they will continue to do or expand things like what they're doing in Ukraine and Georgia, and for that matter, Chechnya and places like that.
So I think there's two comparisons I can bring up. I'll interact with this law enforcement comparison for a bit. So I have a lot of problems with law enforcement. I don't believe in the drug war. The drug war is very personal for me. I lost my mother to it. She was a heroin addict. The major policy disaster. I sympathize with you heavily on the drug war. I sympathize with you heavily on cash bail. I sympathize with you on a lot of these law enforcement. If there was an issue in my town where, let's say, MS-13 started operating heavily in my town, and they started doing some horrendous stuff, murdering people, raping people, I have problems with the drug war. But if there was funding necessary that we had to give the police in order for them to rout out MS-13 from the community and properly deal with it, I can endorse that funding plan without saying I endorse expanding the war on drugs. And if I was to look at that and say, you know what, I don't like the war on drugs, so I don't think we should expand this funding to deal with this MS-13 murders or this or that, I think that would be basically not accepting the reality of the situation, that this is a tool we have currently in place to deal with the issue. It's affecting people now. I wish there was a different thing that we have currently in policing, but we got to address the issue. Another, I think, better foreign policy example would be the British. The British led one of the most brutal and inhumane empires human beings have ever conceived. Of the type of stuff they did in India, or with the Bengal famine, or all these things, very bad. I believe that our plan to give the British weapons to fight the Nazis, even though we're empowering an empire who is doing untold atrocities around the world, was still the correct position, because what we were doing was a net benefit to that situation, to a much bigger threat when we talk about the Nazi regime and stopping that. Even though, if you look around the world, the British killed way more people than the Nazis did.
Yeah, and I understand that. First of all, I want to say I'm very sorry about your mother. That is a horrific thing. No one should have to go through with that.
We are going to talk about drug policy later. I want to get your take on
that. No, and I'm glad that we are. Then that's probably something we're going to agree a little bit. It sounds like more on. Using your example of law enforcement, We actually have something that isn't hypothetical. So in the run-up to the, or I guess after the murder of George Floyd, so this was in May of 2020, and going into June of 2020, what started as protests, mostly for the most part initially entirely peaceful protests against police brutality, very quickly fulminated over into riots. And a large part of why that happened was twofold. Number one, you had police who were focusing on the peaceful protesters and using kettling tactics and basically treating them like rioters, while largely leaving the rest of the communities open to actual rioters and looters. And we have seen instances of where police were ordered to stand down and to basically allow these terrible things to happen, which would only, it doesn't make sense until you realize that this was intentional. The reason they did it was so that they could say, oh no, look at all these terrible things that are happening. We need more funding. We need more power. We need to stop talking about this qualified immunity nonsense and all of that. We need to talk about getting tough on crime. And as a result of that, coming into when a few months later, when Joe Biden was reelected, or Joe Biden was elected, one of the first things he did after basically telling the civil rights groups to screw, hey, thanks for your vote, now screw off, the next thing he did was triple federal funding for policing under the so-called community policing, which really is started under the anti-terrorism and is basically just a slush fund for police departments. He expanded militarization of the police through the 1031, 1033, whatever, the military surplus program. He expanded all of this stuff ostensibly to fight crime. Crime has continued to go up. So I will dispute the idea that the best way to deal with a problem that is either being created or made worse by government is more government. That's actually falling for the trap that they're setting there. MS-13 is a perfect example of that. Depending on which cartel you're talking about, you're either talking about a cartel that is being funded and bankrolled and supported by the U.S. government and its allies, or one that's being funded and bankrolled and armed and supported by Russia or China or some other government. And as a direct result of that, you have MS-13 and the Sinaloa and all these other cartels that are taking over entire countries. That's actually led to the surge of migrants to the U.S. border, escaping the wholesale violence, even sending their children off with strangers, coyotes, human smugglers, on the vain hope that they might actually get safely to the U.S. and put in a cage, because that's still better than being stuck back in their home country where they're almost certain to be rounded up and slaughtered along with their parents. That was created by U.S. military and foreign policy and drug war policy. So no, I don't think that further empowering them is going to fix this. You know, one of the phrases that gets used a lot is, you know, that's like letting the fox in the hen house. And the reason that imagery is used is because you look at it and you think, well, what a foolish thing. Who the hell would put the fox in the hen house? It's the fox that wants to get the hens. But yet here we are discussing the nuances and merits of allowing the fox to get involved, because the fox has the power to really take care of those hens and protect them from the threat of something else. The reality is, we are talking about how much we trust the foxes. I don't trust the foxes. I don't trust not just this government, but I don't trust government in general, and I certainly don't trust a government that has the worst track record. And the last point I want to make is, yes, you can certainly look at positive side effects, for lack of a better word, of things that have happened. Another example is during that brutal campaign of domination that the British Empire did, they also ended slavery in much of the world. So that's a good thing. But does that mean we should have supported the British massive expansion around the world? No, of course not. And in fact, as they were ending slavery in certain countries, they were also expanding or allowing to expand the Atlantic slave trade. So no, I am not a supporter of getting government more involved. I think that the answer is less government and more us as people working together voluntarily for things. Again, if I were sitting in Ukraine, I'd have probably a different story, or at least a willingness to look those things aside. But if I were in Yemen, I'd have an even stronger view of what I have right now.
I think when it comes to this, I do agree that policing has been done terribly in the United States. And I also agree that the government is in large part of the problem, definitely when it comes to the criminalization of drugs, which we're going to talk about later. But I also do believe police officers and law enforcement have a role in combating violent crime, gangs, and criminals. And if there was a problem that developed in my community of violent crime, gangs, and criminals, there would probably need to be more funding allocated to either patrols to make sure that there's not robberies in the neighborhood or people being hurt directly by these violent gangs, or a way to deal with it. And I don't think that the arguments that you all just made about all the terrible things that the police have done would mean that the people have, like, can just be like, well, you know, maybe we'll just do a community watch and that's how we'll deal with MS-13. Because they just don't have the resources or supplies, or even though I would disagree with the vast majority of police militarization, to deal with that. Definitely in my community, which a lot of communities aren't all defended by like AR-15 bearing militiamen. A lot of communities don't have those tools. And
and you can thank the government for that. What I would argue for, instead of saying let's empower the police state, I would say let's end the war on drugs so that the cartels crumble, because that's the entire thing that funds them. Like, we already did this with alcohol prohibition. We tried to get tougher and tougher on crime until finally the people realized, and in that case it took about a decade. Now this time it's taken several decades, and for the most part we still haven't learned our lesson with it. When you create that black market, you're empowering. And we probably agree on this part, but the point that I'm making is I would rather spend my time and energy and resources saying, here is the root cause of this problem, let's address that. Now, that doesn't mean that if, for example, the British government abolishes slavery across the world, I'm going to say that's terrible. But if someone says, hey, we should give more money to the British Empire because of that great thing they're doing, I'd say no, absolutely not. Look at all these other terrible things they're doing. They're still a net harm. That's my take on it. Regarding the police, we probably are going to be at a severe disagreement on there as well. I see law enforcement in the United States as the largest and most violent organized crime group in the United States. That's by virtue of the number of deaths, by virtue of the sheer amount of robbery through things like civil asset forfeiture, by the fact that unlike any other criminal gang, they have immunity in court. I see them as largely as the biggest net cause of harm of any violent organization in the United States, and it's by their own numbers.
I disagree with a few of these points, but I do want to make sure we move on to the second point. I don't want to lose track of it.
Sure.
When it comes to the British, would you or would you not have supported military aid to the British during World War II, considering all the horrific things that I personally would? I think it was a net benefit, even if overall that still empowered what was the developing American military-industrial complex, and it also empowered the British Empire.
I would not have supported the U.S. government giving anything and this is similar to what I would support with Ukraine. If the companies that are making these weapons want to come up with some kind of lend-lease program or something like that, I don't think I would have a problem with that, because that's a government contracting with an organization and us not getting involved. But going further back than that, World War II was no such thing. It was an extension of World War I. And World War I happened because of the U.S. government and other governments around the globe getting involved with a series of absurd treaty enforcements that started with one person getting killed, Franz Ferdinand, and then leading to this massive global war of, or I guess regional war of attrition in the Eurasian continent, and then the massive punishing of especially the Germans afterwards, leading to the Weimar Republic and all of that stuff. So again, root cause, longer term, it was militarism that led to that in the first place. And I'm not letting Hitler off the hook or saying Hitler was fine or anything like that. Hitler was a terrible person. He was absolutely the aggressor in that situation. But the conditions that allowed a crackpot like Hitler to become what he did, what he was, would not have existed absent those other things. So that's, again, going back to why I, as a general rule, I do not support the further centralization and empowerment of existing power structures. I support their decentralization, dismantling, and degradation as much as possible.
I guess for me, like World War I would have happened with or without the United States. We were a late participant. 1917, we did trade and make a lot of money off of the war. Which I mean, you said you have no opposition to private companies making a decision to sell weapons to these countries. But the war would have happened.
I wouldn't say I have no problem with it. But
you don't think the government should stop them?
I don't think the government should necessarily stop them, no, especially not in that situation.
So I don't see how World War II could have been prevented without U.S. involvement, or without, like, World War II was going to happen if World War I happens, unless we go in history and we start, like, taking out Hitler, or Hitler dies as a baby or something like that. I think World War II, due to how the deal was written, honestly, I think without American involvement, the treaty Germany would have gotten probably would have been worse, because Woodrow Wilson was more kind of trying to reel in the Europeans. And so World War II happens, and you can blame the militarization, and I would agree with you, but Europe wasn't a libertarian place during the monarchies. They're not a libertarian place now. So it was going to happen. The war happened, and now the United States is in a position where we either can support the fight against Nazism, the fight against these conquests of Poland and all these countries running the rule themselves, or we could not be involved at all. Even though the winning of this war makes the world probably a more stable place, getting rid of the Nazi regime and the Nazi ideology, which is inherently an aggressive ideology, and it advocates for expansion. I think that was a priority for the world, and especially a priority for Europe. And the structures we built afterwards basically kept Europe at peace for the next, like, 80 years, until what, like Yugoslavia and the collapse of the Soviet Union, outside of maybe like the Soviet invasion of Hungary, or small spats of violence. So I do think that our contribution to that war effort was definitely moral and the correct thing to do. It made the world a more stable place, a better place.
It made that region a more stable place. It also empowered the U.S. to be essentially a unipolar power around the world and do horrific things throughout Latin America, throughout Africa, throughout Asia, throughout the Middle East, which continued on for decades and even decades.
We weren't a unipolar power until the end of the Cold War.
Well, and I shouldn't say unipolar is a bit strong, but certainly the power.
We were one of the big
power to the, but it was, I mean, they were the prime power, and more importantly to this discussion, rather than getting into a semantics over they were unipolar, multipolar, whatever, they killed hundreds of thousands and millions of people around the globe. So yes, was Europe more stable? Sure, yes, but at the cost of the U.S. becoming this greatly empowered. I mean, thank God another country got the nukes, because the only thing that kept MacArthur from dropping dozens of nukes in China was that Truman was so weary of what he saw with Fat Man and Little Boy in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I forget which one was which, but in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, thankfully it was a war-weary, death-weary president who said, no, we're not going to do that. But had it been another president, would they have been willing to do that? Had there been no threat of a nuclear response to that? Absolutely. So I will say that even if you can look and again, we could get into whether U.S. involvement in World War I would have led to, or U.S. not being involved, would that have led to Germany being treated worse because they weren't reigning in Europe, or would it have led to Germany being treated better because the war would have dragged on longer and Germany and the Ottomans would have been in a better position to negotiate? I don't know, and there's no way of being able to say that hypothetical. But what we can say from the benefit of the knowledge that we have from history is that we are looking at every time that a government gets empowered, and especially to the level that the U.S. and Russia and China and countries like this are getting, lots and lots and lots of people die. And so in the same way that you could just as easily flip it around and make an argument for the Russian military-industrial complex growing in order to be a check to the U.S. Military-industrial complex, and I would oppose that. I also would oppose the flip side for the U.S. military-industrial complex to grow in order to stop Russia. And I understand that we're not going to see eye to eye on this, and I'm okay with that. But that's my standpoint is coming from I believe that empowering these powers just causes more net harm long term, even if and when it causes an immediate positive for people. So I completely understand. There are many people that are demonizing, Zelensky or Ukrainians for trying to get as much as they possibly can. I certainly understand the situation they're in, and I would imagine I would probably be in a similar situation. I would be in a similar situation if I lived in Yemen, begging people to please get involved to stop the U.S. dominance that's happening there through the Saudi government and through Al Qaeda, and hoping to God that someone actually attacked the U.S. to give them a taste of what we were having over there. But from where I am, I just see this as this is a net harm that's being done, and the more we feed it, the worse it gets.
I guess for me, when we're going to move on in a bit, but I just want to make sure that I address everything so I'm not thinking afterwards, I wanted to say this. I made sure. I don't want to repeat anything, but I think that us winning the Second World War was a net benefit for society. That the Germans, due to their ideology and their goals, would have produced a much worse world, not only in Europe, but in Africa, because they had colonial ambitions there, as well with the Imperial Japanese and the Italians, who had this idea of rebuilding a Rome. And our aid was vital, not only to the Soviet Union, but it was vital to the UK, and our sanctions on Japan, and what we were doing to them and try to strangle their oil imports was also vital in stopping the Japanese conquest of China. And our involvement in the war was vital in liberating large swaths of territory throughout the world. And it was also probably an integral part of what would eventually become the Philippine independence movement, even if our colonialism in the Philippines was really bad. I think us winning was a net benefit. I don't think you disagree with that, because I don't think you're insane. I agree with you on this. But I think that our involvement was necessary for that war to be won in the way it was. I'm not so confident that without the large amount of support we gave the Soviet Union and these other powers, and then our eventual involvement, I mean, obviously, we can't prove either way, that the war would have gone the way it was. It, at the least, would have lasted longer. At the least, it would have lasted longer. It would have taken longer for the Soviets to get to Berlin. And I guess for me, after seeing the Russian invasion of Chechnya and the crushing of the republic that was developed there, after seeing what they did in Georgia and what they've done in Ukraine for the last 8 years, I am not confident that if we were to stop all of our aid, and we were to try to negotiate with the Russians, that the Russians would be like, okay, I think this is enough. Not that what they've already conquered is rightfully theirs at all. I think you agree with me on this, but I don't think that they would necessarily stop there. And the justification they used to invade Ukraine could easily be applied to Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and all of the other post-Soviet states that were created after the Soviet Union collapsed. And so I think that this aid is saving lives. We obviously disagree about that. That's okay. I still respect you due to the fact that you reeled in your stuff. We disagree about this. Is there anything else you wanted to say? Oh, I did want to talk about the Budapest Memorandum for a moment. I disagreed with you so much when you said this, when you were talking to Destiny. I don't think there was any reality where Ukraine kept its nuclear when it gave it up. They were a state in economic desperation. The financial investments they would have needed to make to maintain the nuclear arsenal was immense. I mean, they had what was essentially the third or fourth largest arsenal in the world. They wanted to get security guarantees once they gave up the nukes. I think their mistake,
which have been worth what?
I think their mistake was
security guarantees.
Exactly. I think their mistake was not getting it on paper that if this country invades me, you will come and physically stop it. Because that has worked for Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Hungary, and all the other post-Soviet states. And I have no reason to believe that in the ground, encapsulated security guarantees that come with a direct military response wouldn't have worked in Ukraine as well. I think it would have. It's worked everywhere else.
So first of all, there wouldn't have been a Budapest Memorandum that resulted in, I mean, from what it sounds like, you're saying, Ukraine becoming a part of NATO.
Not a part of NATO. There can be independent, for example, Philippines isn't in NATO, but they have security guarantees with the United States.
But for all of that aside, I mean, we've seen we have a security guarantee right now, and Ukraine still got invaded twice.
What was the security guarantee?
The security guarantee was that neither side was going to invade them.
Well, we didn't invade them.
I know we didn't invade them, but that's the point I'm making. So, Dylan, here's the point I'm making on both. And meanwhile, I'm not sure that they would want to keep the entire stockpile. But the fact is, they gave up the one surefire thing to make sure that no one is going to actually try to invade their territorial integrity, and that's having even a small nuclear arsenal. That one thing would have been enough to stop it in its tracks. But the U.S. The U.S. doctrine is one of so-called nuclear non-proliferation, which basically means we get to have nukes, Russia gets to have nukes, China gets to have nukes, France gets to have nukes, the UK gets to have nukes. Oops, India and Pakistan got nukes. I guess we'll have to live with that. North Korea has nukes, so I guess we'll have to live with that. Israel probably has nukes, and we're fine with that. But no one else can have nukes because it would be a threat to global security. And so, as a direct result of that doctrine, this entire thing was able to happen in the first place. Like, this whole thing would have never happened if Ukraine, and they wouldn't need to maintain the third largest nuclear arsenal, but certainly even just having a nuclear arsenal would have been more than enough to completely change the trajectory of all of this stuff. Long before invasion of Crimea happened, long before any of that happened, there wouldn't have been any threat of any of this, because people would have known that if that happened, they're getting nuked. It's not just, we're going to send your soldiers home in body bags. It's we're going to turn your cities into glass.
I do agree with you. And most nations, I think, would, if they ever had nukes, hold on to them for definitely nations in this part of the world, considering Ukraine's history with its struggle for independence. Voltaire wrote about it back in the day. They've been trying for this for a while. And you would think they would be okay, we have this. This will be a strong guarantee of independence. But they didn't see it that way. They saw it as an economic burden. I disagree with the conclusion. I think that national security obviously was more important, but the Ukrainian government and the majority of Ukrainian political parties didn't agree with it at the time.
I know.
So they did what was the next best thing. But I would also, because you went back and forth with Destiny about this, the idea of a defensive shield versus everyone having nukes. The less countries that have nukes, I think, does produce less risk for a nuclear disaster to take place. I mean, obviously, there's a risk of one country having nukes because Nagasaki, Hiroshima. But when more and more countries have nukes, there's more opportunities for a nuke to be sold into the black market to some terror organization, nukes to literally go missing, which has happened with the U.S. arsenal. There is a real risk of more and more nations getting nukes, and then more and more nations making the same mistakes. Nations that have no experience with nuclear arsenals or have very bad.
Yeah. So you mentioned I believe it's 23 nukes that have gone missing in the U.S. arsenal. I would argue that a U.S., Russia, China, even a France or UK, but certainly U.S., Russia, China are more likely to lose, give away, or sell nukes to bad actors, to act as in a very short-sighted and terrible foreign policy standpoint way, to act as a hedge against the other side. They'd be far more likely to do that than a Ukraine, or for that matter, an India or a Pakistan who has a relatively modest number of nukes, and specifically for a defensive purpose. I think the risk overall is pretty low. I think, first of all, just you mentioned it, the sheer amount of economic investment that has to go into getting, and in the case of Ukraine, they already had them, but maintaining that nuclear arsenal. I think that they also know the risk, especially a Ukraine who, through Chernobyl, knows what a nuclear disaster can look like, and that wasn't even a weapon. I don't think that the risk is any higher among a, admittedly, maybe not as wealthy country, but a country that's probably more likely to be mindful of its arsenal than a U.S. that has, or a Russia or China that has so many to spare that that they can find the good guys who end up being the next round of bad guys that they give or sell them to. So I would argue not on that. I mean, this is wildly hypothetical, because we live in the so-called rules-based order of so-called nuclear non-proliferation. It's funny. The one thing that the Russians, if there's one thing Russia, China, and the U.S. agree on, it's that pretty much no other country should have nukes. That we should keep the number of countries with nukes down to an absolute minimum. And honestly, I think the single biggest reason.
Clear though, it's not just U.S., China, and Russia. It's the majority of nations that believe.
Well, you say that, but the thing is, I think if tomorrow you had the U.S. and Russia and China, or even just the U.S., say our policy now is, we're no longer going to enforce the nuclear non-proliferation treaties, I think that you would see very quickly a rush of countries to develop at least one or two or a handful of nuclear weapons, or build some kind of multilateral agreement with other smaller countries, if they're a small country, to have their, kept in common nuclear shield. The point I made with Destiny is that part of the reason why the Eastern Bloc countries are so reliant in the first place on the U.S. and NATO forces to buttress their ability to defend or to deter invasion by Russia or any other country is precisely because they've been put in a situation of reliance on us, where we act as the world police, and sort of in the same way that if you live in a place that is, it almost becomes like a Baltimore, where guns aren't allowed unless you're a police officer, and so everyone's forced into reliance on the police for their safety, and that fails immediately, and so it's one of the most dangerous places in the country. In a similar fashion, if you have it where in a place where an invasion is most likely to happen, these small former Soviet countries right next to a large and increasingly expansionary Russia with increasingly bellicose and invasionary type of rhetoric, that to tell them, no, don't worry about it, we've got you, that led to this. I would have been a lot more agreeable to the idea of saying, you know what, let's get the U.S. military out of this. Let's get NATO out of this, and let's start having these countries empower themselves to be able to defend themselves, so that now they aren't having to travel across the country and go to Congress and ask us for another however many $1 billion in weapons and funding, because they've already got it in place there, and they've already got all of their defense structures in place there. I think that longer term, there's going to have to be a decentralization of the poles here, so that there is a much more multipolar distribution of power and ability to project force is the number one way to prevent these kinds of invasions from happening in the first place.
So I would disagree. I would agree with the idea that putting all of the burden on nations like the United States to basically act as the world police, even though I do think involved in building a more prosperous future, I do agree with that. I think it should be done by organizations like the UN, which should be empowered, which I think we disagree, but I don't want to get too much into that.
Yeah, no, we definitely disagree on that.
But when it comes to these nuclear weapons, I am scared of that thing that you're talking about happening. A bunch of small countries racing to get nuclear weapons. Because I think just statistically, and I think this is how most world leaders think about it as well, and that's why the majority of nations vote against ending nuclear non-proliferation, is because when that race happens and they've acquired nuclear weapons, think of how many times we were on the brink of nuclear war, whether it was the Soviet submarine that just like one commander stopped it, or the amount of glitches that happened with US, Soviet, or Chinese technology. Was missiles impound, did we respond, or how many nukes were lost? We would be amplifying that to a much larger degree, and amplifying it to countries who have no experience with this. And what countries would they be going to? And what countries would they be going to get the experience from? In some instances, it would be the United States or Russia or China, which I think are more respectable than others, than how they've dealt with the nuclear arsenal, even though they have much bigger problems. But then there's others they might go to, like say North Korea, like Saddam Hussein did, that would be a lot less respectable when it probably comes to safety standards. Not only because they probably don't care as much, but also because they just don't have the money to properly take care of their nuclear arsenal. They don't have the resources. I'm scared of just statistically, we give more and more countries these nuclear weapons, it's just more likely that an accident's going to happen or something spirals out of control. Definitely, since a lot of these countries are not going to be countries with stable, responsible governments, but they're going to be unstable and irresponsible governments, or at least more irresponsible than the ones that have already had nuclear weapons. Like the Eritrean government with nuclear weapons sounds like a disaster waiting to happen.
Well, I mean, the Eritrean government has never committed a genocide, and the U.S. has committed multiple ones here and abroad. There is one country that has used nukes in anger, and to be fair, they're not the hydrogen bombs that are thousands of times more powerful, but frankly, they didn't know what they were dropping. They knew it was very powerful, and they knew it would be unlike anything that had ever been dropped, and there was a lot of threat of this becoming part of the regular arsenal moving forward, and the only thing that stopped that, the only thing that stopped the U.S. from making that just the new carpet bombing was the fact that one other country ended up getting it. Now, that one other country was not by any means a stable or responsible country. It was the Soviet Union. But the fact that there was one other country that had it was enough to create the whole mutually assured destruction doctrine. You mentioned the fact about how there were all of these times, the Cuban Missile Crisis, but times that were way worse than that we only found out about in recent years, where there were people on both sides who, because of mixed signals or because of malfunctions in equipment, they were under the belief that the the other side had already launched their arsenal and were already nuking their country. And every single time that came up, that person said, no, I'm not going to be responsible for killing tens, hundreds of millions of people and possibly ending the ability for human beings to survive on this planet. That wasn't because of expense, and that wasn't because of government stability. That was because of the inherent survival instinct that normal human beings have. So I would say the only thing that would greatly increase, or rather greatly decrease, in the result of having more countries that would have access to even a small nuclear arsenal, what would greatly decrease is the ability of countries like Russia and the US and China to be able to invade and bomb and destabilize those countries. The knowledge that they could cause hundreds of thousands or millions or even tens of millions of people in their home countries to die if they did that would be enough to have them show the same discretion to not bomb and invade all these different bomb and invade and destabilize all these different countries as those people in those, you know, life or death moments during all those heated times during the Cold War also chose not to do. So I mean, again, this is going to be a fundamental disagreement.
Yeah. Okay. So I think this might. When you say Eritrea has never committed a genocide, what would you call what they did to Tigrayans?
I would say that whatever they have done pales in comparison. And again, if only because of their capability. But the reality is, if they have nukes and the knowledge that others have nukes, that's no longer people attacking each other with guns and with small arms or even with somewhat more advanced weapon systems. That's countries ending. Yeah, so well, I think that a lot of these a
lot of what Eritrea has done when it comes to Tigrayans, the extermination and like a lot of the killings that it's done, that government with nuclear weapons scares me. And that's not to say the American government doesn't scare me with nuclear weapons, but more scary governments with more nuclear weapons just statistically feels like a disaster waiting to happen. We disagree on this. That's fine. I do want to move on to the other topics. We only have like 15 minutes left, so I want to make sure we get through everything.
3 minutes per topic. Yes.
Yes. Do you think there is a large risk of a nuclear war breaking out in Russia, Ukraine? I personally say no, but do you believe that?
I mean, with the caveat that any escalation from the status quo is a very dangerous one because of the stakes that involves. I honestly don't believe so. I think as long as, and I may be wrong, and again, this is why I don't believe we should play these kinds of games, because I could be wrong. I think provided that United States military doesn't directly get involved, as in like sending troops to Ukraine, bombing Russia or bombing Russian positions in Ukraine, or, you know, bombing a Russian position elsewhere or bombing positions in Belarus or something like that, I think the risk remains pretty low. I think this whole thing is escalating it on all sides. And again, even a 0.1% increase is concerning. But no, I personally, and I know many people on the anti-war side that disagree with me on this, I personally don't believe it is. I'm certainly no crystal ball reader in that respect, but I don't believe that it is. That's not my immediate concern. But I will say this: any amount of escalation has that potential. I don't think that that's a clear and present threat. Even Putin's own words, he uses that when he talks about the possibility of using nukes, he uses the same weasel wording that George W. Bush used during the War on Terror, where he would say things like, I will use whatever is at our arsenal, at our disposal, that's necessary to defend America, and even including nukes. And everyone would go, oh, he's threatening nukes. No, he's not. He's just saber rattling and basically, I personally don't believe so, but I didn't think they were going to invade, so maybe you shouldn't listen to me on that.
Oh no, the monkey paw curls its finger.
The Spike Cohen jinx. Russia would never do that. No, I don't know, but I would guess not. But again, this is why this kind of stuff is so risky, is because nukes are involved.
Now, despite the war in Ukraine, we actually do live in an unprecedented time when it comes to war and conflict in the world, in that it's actually a lot less common than it used to be. That's not to say that these wars aren't deadly or they're not horrific, but it's less. We have less war and conflict than we used to. Why do you think that is?
I think honestly, a lot of it has to do with economics. I think that the more, and it's specifically trade. There's the old adage.
Are you a globalist like me?
I'm a supporter of unrestricted free trade. I'm not a globalist. I'm an individualist. I don't believe anyone should be able to tell you who you should be able to interact with and be able to trade goods and services for with money. And so I'm not a trade protectionist. I think that trade protectionism is as economically as illiterate as it gets. And you could argue that Smoot-Hawley and the other trade protectionism policies that happened starting in the 1910s and 1920s around the world led to the global depressions, which led to the arguably to the conditions for World War I, but certainly helped with the conditions toward World War II. So no, I think that the more people are trading goods and services, the less likely they are to trade bombs and missiles.
I'll probably disagree with you on some of the specifics. I do generally agree with you that our interconnectedness as states, when it comes to the internet, when it comes to trade, when it comes to visa-free travel in places like the EU, like these are things that are promoters of peace. And this is one of my main agreements that I find with libertarians, is that the more nations are economically intertwined or diplomatically intertwined or intertwined when it comes to travel and workforces, the less likely they are to blow each other up. Because if you blow up the neighbor that you buy your cocoa beans from, that means no more cocoa beans. And I think this is probably one of the main things we would agree with. What do you think is the best way to promote this?
Through the promotion of global trade. I think that the one thing that was done, even though I agree that unilateral free trade is still a net benefit, if this country's government wants to impose trade taxes on its consumers and harm them economically, then that's their choice, and that shouldn't affect our policy. But the problem is the optics of doing that make it look like the U.S. government and the Western world are telling these countries, okay, you can tax our stuff, but we won't tax your stuff, and so we'll just give all of our jobs to you. And so what that leads to is a push for trade protectionism. So what I would push for is something more aligned. I heard someone once call it mirror trade or harmonized trade, where we would go to countries and say, hey, listen, whatever your net regulatory and tariff and tax burden on our goods and services going into your country are, that's what we're going to have on yours. So if you would like for us to have little to no tariffs and restrictions on trade with your country, then you do that with us. And I think that you want to talk about soft power, the soft power of the U.S. going around and saying, hey, we can be your biggest trading partner if we're not already. And we can be an even bigger trading partner, but it requires you, meeting us on your side with having lower barriers, and the lower you the more you lower your barriers, your tariffs and your restrictions and limits on certain numbers of imports and things like that, we'll do the same on our side. I think that's probably the single biggest way, both in terms of pushing for those countries to adopt more tariff-free trade towards us, but also for us to show our population, see, we're not just giving it all away, we're working with them and lowering it for everyone so we can all trade freely. And honestly, education's a big part of it too. A lot of people just don't understand how trade works. They see it as we're giving our money away. And I try to tell people, listen, you have a massive trade surplus or trade deficit with your local grocery store. You just keep giving them money and they just keep giving you stuff. Do you feel like you're being screwed there? Like, do you think that's a bad arrangement and they should be forced to pay to charge you additional trade taxes in order to try to reduce that trade deficit by not letting you be able to buy as much at the store? So, you try to use analogies like that, but from a policy standpoint, it would be harmonization of trade policy between the countries.
What do you think about, and oh God, hopefully one day we can talk again, because I would love to talk to you about the UN, because I am a UN cuck. I love the United Nations. I have a lot of problems with it, but I was president of my Model UN. I started my Model UN at my school. I'm all about the UN. So maybe in the future we can have another discussion about that.
How old are you, by the way?
I'm 21.
Okay.
I'm a young guy, but I'm young, but I'm pepper. I'm young. I'm energetic. I got that youth energy in me that a lot of my colleagues don't. And it also means I'm less intimidating to people. And so that means I get more opportunities and people open up around me, which I really appreciate. But I look like I'm a lot older than I am, which then blunts that effect. Because I wear a beard and I look scraggly. I look like a barbarian. From going
I would have guessed 20s. I wouldn't have guessed 21, but I would have guessed 20s. But yeah, I mean, we certainly could talk again about the UN. Long story short, the UN is essentially a government of governments, and you know how I think about the government.
I would talk to you about, because people talk about Mogadishu, people talk about Haiti. I love talking about the success of peacekeeping operation and how little money it's cost to be so much more successful in Afghanistan. But that's for another day. I want to do a speed round since we only have 5 minutes left. I want to get through this. I am a big supporter of legalizing marijuana, legalizing psychedelics, LSD, a lot of drugs, and at the very least decriminalizing the use of things like heroin. I don't know about legalization because I'm very nervous about that type of stuff. See how it's destroyed people. What is your ideal drug system and how the country deals with it?
My ideal drug system is something closer to alcohol for everything. And I share even before hearing about the horrific thing that happened with your mother, I have lost people to heroin and to other drugs. I myself am a recovering drug addict. I've been clean for, this will be my 17th year now, later this year. And I've seen how it's destroyed lives. I've seen how the war on drugs makes it worse. When people talk about their fears of legalizing or at least decriminalizing these drugs, they describe people dying in the streets and cartels taking over. They're describing the status quo. They're describing what the drug war increases the conditions and makes favorable conditions for more of that to happen. I support, if the government's going to be involved at all when it comes to preferably not at all, but if it's going to be involved at all with dealing with people who are addicted to the more serious drugs, it's to provide them with rehab, to provide them with a chance to rehab, not as a carrot with the stick of, punishment and jail time. We should not be criminalizing a health problem. And addiction is a health problem, usually a manifestation of other problems like PTSD and other things like that. But no, my preferred system would be recognizing that drug prohibition is every bit the disaster, and even more so than alcohol prohibition was, and going to a policy of treating it like a still serious intoxicating drug, not cannabis, because cannabis is a medicinal herb, but for the most part, treating it like a serious drug, but recognizing you're not going to get rid of the demand, and all you're going to do is, empower cartels by keeping it illegal.
2 questions. First question, I still believe that alcohol should be illegal at a certain age, that certain people, due to the negative effects can have on young people, that obviously like young 14, 13-year-olds should not be able to go and buy a bottle of schnapps, right? I also would believe in this system that would exist as well. Do you disagree with me that there should be age limits when it comes to these types of substances if they're going to go and buy them?
I think at the very least, those things should be decided more locally, either at the state level or at a more local level than having a federal standard. I mean, it's interesting you mentioned alcohol. In parts of Europe, it is very normal for teenagers to have a glass of wine with dinner, something that, would give us all pause. Those of us who are pretending to have, some of us are pretending to have pause while still having their teens drink like they did back in the old country. But I would say that I don't support any national standard for when someone should be allowed to smoke or drink or anything else. And I will say the sheer irony of, someone being able to sign up to go and handle multi-million-dollar weapon systems and fight overseas and kill people and possibly die, and then come home as a veteran of that war and still have about a year before they can legally smoke or drink. I think that's absurd.
But I was working, and I was working in the Maryland state, and I was there when they were going to pass a law to bring the smoking age from 18 to 20. And I was next to a senator talking to them about it, and I watched as they got up and they made the compromise that, because people brought up, what about the veterans? We can give these guys guns and they'll go overseas and they'll kill people. It's like, okay. If you're in the military, you're allowed to smoke, but if you're not and you're 18, then you can't. Like they completely avoided the moral question.
Yes.
And just
Yes.
like it was insane to me.
Band-aid. It's a band-aid. Yeah. No, if you sign up for the military, you can rent a car as soon as you get home, but no one else can. Yeah.
I love this idea. Like, what are the, like, there has to be at least one like recruiter out there. Like, one of the perks is you can have one of these. You sign this piece of paper. You want a Marlboro? Like,
gun. You can smoke a joint. You can drink. You can rent a car. The world is your oyster. All you have to do is about 1.5 years, 2 years overseas.
Yeah. Okay. A next question, cash bail. What's your thoughts on it?
So, it's interesting. My position has become a little bit more nuanced in the last year after talking with criminal justice advocates. So my first, and I still believe this, is that when cash bail is basically the idea that the decision of whether you get to go home or not while you're still, before you've been proven guilty, while still presumed innocent, has nothing to do with whether you pose any threat to the community or a threat to flee, but whether you have the money or not. And that leads to, wealthy people being able to flee or being able to cause more harm, while other people who aren't as wealthy get stuck in jail, sometimes for, weeks, months, sometimes for years in some cases. Khalif Browder was someone who was accused of shoplifting, and he spent the better part of, I believe, 2 or 3 years in Rikers Island before a judge finally saw his case and said, whether he's guilty or not, he never saw a trial, and he would have never been in jail this long if he had actually been found guilty. He's going home. Unfortunately, he was so broken from that experience, he ended up committing suicide. There are many more cases of people who plead guilty to crimes they never committed because they can't afford to get out, and they can't afford to lose everything, to lose their jobs, to lose their families. I think cash bail, as it exists, is a terrible system. The question is, what do you replace it with? And so I used to say, okay, well then, we just have the judge decide whether the person is a threat to the public or a threat to flee. But the problem is, the judge has a perverse incentive to just say no to everyone in that situation. Because if you're a judge, you have 1,000 people in front of you, you set 1,000 of them, you'd say these 1,000 people pose, I don't see any immediate risk, they should be able to go home on their own recognizance. If 999 of them do no harm to anyone, but one of them does something horrific, a rape or kill or something like that, no one's going to say, oh yeah, but on the balance, what the judge did was good. They say that judge is soft on criminals, and look what he did. So it actually could lead to more people just being kept locked into jail, throw away the key, which would actually add more burden to the criminal justice system and lead to more people having to wait even longer potentially for their trial to ever happen, which means they're just going to plead guilty just to get out. So I've heard of systems like, I believe it's called non-bonded cash bail. I've also heard of systems that would allow for the decision to be made by a judge, where the judge isn't known. I'm not even sure how that would work because of our laws on due process, I think, require for everyone to know who's involved. I've heard of one where it would be decided through some kind of algorithm and there's not even a human involvement at all. But whatever it is, the cash bail system has to be replaced with something. Just the answer of what to replace it with is, it turns out it's a little bit more murky.
So I have like 5 questions left. I won't say anything. I just want to get through them. I know we're past your time.
I'll give like 30-second answers. Okay.
Okay. Right. Private prisons. Okay.
They ostensibly were going to save taxpayer money, which they probably did, but they also created a lobby that advocates for more rules and more restrictions on them. I think on the balance, they've been a harm, but they're not the problem. They're a symptom of the problem, which is the police to prison and industrial complex that we have in this country, and that needs to be dismantled. Private prisons are just a symptom of that.
Death penalty.
I'm against the death penalty, and
Amen.
I live in the state where Dylan Roof killed a bunch of people in Mother Emanuel Church. And when he's executed, no doubt he'll be executed, I'm not going to shed a tear. But my calculation on this is very simple. We know that for I believe it's every 8 people who are convicted and given sentenced to the death penalty, one of them will be exonerated. Most of them will be exonerated before they are executed, but some of them won't. And so if I have to choose between 7 Dylan Roofs serving prison without any hope of parole for the rest of their lives, never to see the light of day again, or one innocent person going through the horrific process, knowing they did nothing wrong, of being tried, convicted, spending years appealing it, and still being executed, that calculation's simple for me. I'm against the death penalty in all cases.
I couldn't agree more with you. Should we hire more immigration judges?
I think we should have a lot more streamlined immigration system to begin with. That may not even require as many judges. I mean, the foundation of this country, the founders didn't even think that the government should restrict who comes into the country. The question of naturalization, of becoming a citizen, they only wanted landowning white men to be, landowning white men to be able to vote, and they only wanted white people, for the most part, to become citizens. But even them, as racist and even xenophobic as they were, they still thought anyone who wanted to come should be able to come. That only changed largely due to labor unionists pushing economically illiterate policies of immigration restriction along with trade restrictions, and both have been disastrous. It's led the immigration, the war on migration has led to the same cartelization of that process as the war on drugs has. So I think it should be greatly streamlined, and I think that if someone wants to come here and participate in the American experience, I think they should be able to, and I think the burden should be on the government to prove that they mean any harm, not on them to prove that they don't. Simply put, when my dad's side of the family came here to escape pogroms, if they had come and the system were the way it were now.
Can I ask what country?
I believe what is now considered Belarus, but at the time was I believe Russia. And that's part of my dad's side of the family, and the other side came through the UK came through Egypt via the UK and then Canada. But the side that came from that, really both sides, when they came here, had the immigration process not been, stand in line here, tell us your name, and let's check and see if you have TB. Now, welcome to the American experience.
They have to get your name wrong and Americanize it.
Right. Yes, and you have to turn it to Cohen. Then, if it had not been that, if it had been a much more strict system, then they probably wouldn't have been allowed here, and they probably would have ended up dying. So I am a great proponent of greatly streamlining the immigration system.
This is a niche foreign policy issue, but I talked to Larry Sharp about it. I love Larry, great guy, wonderful guy. Foreign fighters. A lot of countries will see a conflict, like a war, for example, Ukraine, will go up, get in a plane, go over there and fight. My position is I think that's okay. I think people should, if they care about a cause, they should go over there. Obviously, I went over there. So I'm not a fighter, but I went over there because I cared. So I obviously believe that's okay. I do think that certain organizations, the government should step in and stop them from joining, like international terrorist organizations, ISIS and others. Do you think it's the government's role to control that type of movement of people, to stop somebody from going and joining ISIS or going and joining Al-Qaeda?
Well, the problem is they're often going to be funded and bankrolled by the CIA. But the absent that, the question is, I think that if someone is going to join an organization that is explicitly built to harm and terrorize innocent people, then I think that that's actionable, at least to the extent of if they actually start trying to be involved in it. And that's different than going to try to defend support and defending a country. I would be very wary. It's not to say I don't think necessarily there should be any involvement, but I would definitely say I would be very wary of the U.S. government's motives. I know you're shocked to hear that, but I would be very wary of the U.S. government's motives in trying to restrict people. What is the ultimate goal there, especially considering every major terror group that the U.S. has fought in our lifetimes was at one point or another our ally at that point, which is another thing that scares me about Ukraine. What could potentially be started and created now that we don't even know about? Everyone's talking about the Azov brigades, but there could be something completely different, or Azov battalion, or whichever it is, but something else could be created, and 20 years from now we're hearing about these horrific Ukrainian terrorists that are going around, or whatever, even if they only started as freedom fighters. So did the Mujahideen. So did the street militias that were fighting against the Shia incursions into their neighborhoods post invasion of Iraq, and then they turned into Al Qaeda and the Taliban and ISIS. So I'm the U.S. picking winners and losers, and governments in general picking winners or losers. I will say I question their motives.
Obviously, I disagree with you on Ukraine as an example for that, but I do want to get to this last story because I don't.
I just want to be clear on something. I'm not saying that's going to happen. I'm saying it could happen. I'm saying that.
I mean, but couldn't that happen in any war though? Like any war, like what could have happened in World War II? Yeah, but like the war. The thing is, that's why war should be generally avoided. But when the war happens, like you have to deal with it. You have to deal with. Okay, I don't want to bring us back to it. I want to make sure I get to this. I want to tell you this story because we talked about like a possible nuclear disaster. Are you familiar with the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant?
This is the one that's under threat of shelling and things like that. Yes. in I forget the name of the region, but the eastern region in Ukraine.
Zaporozhye.
Zaporozhye. Okay. All right.
So I was down there in Mykolaiv to film at a hospital that had been bombed, and just film in the area, talk to locals, and deliver aid to a dog shelter. And while we were down there, the Kherson counteroffensive, very intensive fighting. We actually got shelled while we were in the city. Civilians, it was a very bad day. But the next day, we went across the river from the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. And we had to sleep because we wanted to film and talk to the locals about it because kind of crazy to ask somebody. So some people say this is the next Chernobyl and you're living right next to it. Like, what would be the effects on your life? It's pretty, I didn't see any other reporters do that, so I wanted to do that. I wanted to be the first.
Yeah.
During the night, I had to smoke a lot to fall asleep. All legal tobacco, of course, but I had to smoke a lot to go to sleep. Because the shelling was so heavy. It was the heaviest shelling I saw the entirety of the war. I heard 50 explosions in a 30-second time period. That's when I was awake. It was shelling when I was asleep, too. And the shells were falling very close to the plant. It was sometimes difficult to tell exactly where the shells are falling from, but they were explosions that looked like volcano eruptions happening within a mile of the plant. And the thing is, the next day, the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, went to the plant, went over there, and they did amazing work. Do you think there's any value? They put up monitors and they did work. They did what they could with the Russians. Do you think there's any value to countries funding organizations like the IAEA or organizations that specifically monitor stuff like this, since a disaster at Zaporozhye would be on the Dnieper River and it's the largest nuclear power plant? This could have effects not only on Ukraine, but on countries all across the world. Do you think governments, in their own interests, should be funding organizations like?
I'm not going to pretend to be an expert specifically on what IAEA has done in their history.
I understand. I'm very niche into this stuff.
Which is why I hesitate to say, yes, we should be funding them, because for all I know, they're doing all these other horrific, and they may not be.
What I will say in general is the spirit of an organization.
The spirit of having a as neutral as possible third party stepping in and saying, sort of like a Red Cross for nuke plants, saying listen, whoever wins this, whoever's side, that we're not worried about that. We want to make sure that this nuclear plant is operating, and that it's operating efficiently, but at the very least isn't unsafe. And let's try to make a safe zone around the nuke zone that could kill us all. And I think that there is definitely a value in that, obviously, in the same way that in another front, organization like the Red Cross, having people in war zones, Red Cross, Red Crescent, Red Magen David, or so forth, that to be involved in and to not be part of any military conflict, pro or against either side, but just there to try to ameliorate the harm that's being done as a result of that. So yeah, to whatever extent there is something like that for nuclear plants, or for if there was a chemical facility or anything like that that could pose a major harm to loss of life, yeah, I think that there should be something like that. Again, I'm not going to weigh in specifically on AIA, but like you said, the spirit behind something like that, yeah, uninterested third party. And honestly, the more of that's allowed in a battlefield, I would think the more that leads to at least some level of humanization of the fact that whatever conflict is happening, there's still a world that needs to be able to function. And to whatever extent that softens people to the reality that, you know, we're going to have to move past this war at some point. We still have nuclear plants. We still have these needs for protection and safety. I think it's a net good.
Obviously, we didn't agree on everything. We probably disagreed on most things. But we also had some ground where I feel like libertarians and libertards like myself can work together and really advance on issues we care about, like the drug war, like cash bail, these issues. Where can people, I want to thank you for taking your time to talk to me today. I really appreciate it. I wish we got to maybe drink together while we were at LibertyCon, but I understand you're a very busy guy, Mr. Vice Presidential Nominee. Isn't that awesome? Is that a good feeling, being able to say that? Like, I ran for vice president for at least the third biggest party in the country, right?
Yeah, I like to call myself the vice presidential bronze medalist of 2020. It's pretty interesting, especially the history of that. I did not expect to even get the nomination until about a month before it happened, so I was as surprised as anyone else.
I gotta say, yeah, Berman Supreme did not get to run for president. You and your lovely Joe sabotaged the dreams of many meme lovers and stuff like that. Do you have any regret for sabotaging that hero?
I would like to remind everyone, I was Vermin's proposed running mate. So I didn't sabotage. I helped Vermin basically tie for second in the final round. So I did everything I could to create the future that already exists in an alternative timeline where Vermin Supreme is indeed president, which is weird because if you follow the whole Vermin lore, he tells you that he's come back in time to warn you not to let him become president because of the nightmare that will ensue. And here we are trying to make him president.
This was not an E2 Bruce moment, you would say? This is not one of those
no, this was I'm trying to think of a literary analogy, but this was me. I tried my best. I did everything I could.
Do you think he would have actually been a good candidate for the Libertarian Party because he would have got attention, or would he reinforce the idea the Libertarian Party is a joke?
That's the problem. He would have gotten more attention than any other candidate. They could not have not paid attention to him. I argue that he possibly would have gotten us more votes than we've ever gotten before, but now for the next 20 to 1,000 years, we are the party of the guy with the boot on his head. I mean, there was a guy who's not even in the party anymore, who in 2016 got on, just some member of the party. He was not in leadership. He was not running for anything. He got up on stage and danced in a thong for about 7 seconds before he was tackled and thrown off stage. And we're still known as the party of the dancing fat naked guy.
I have seen that video.
So,
yes.
Yeah, and the thing is, like, again, this was a member of the party. He's not even in the party anymore. He was a member of the party. He got up there. He did it for, I don't know, 10 seconds. It wasn't very long at all. He was immediately got off stage as soon as they could possibly get him off stage. But yet we were stuck with that. Now imagine if our presidential candidate had been a man wearing a boot on his head, carrying a giant toothbrush in one hand and a pony figurine in the other, and promising everyone free ponies and telling them that he's going to put them in camps if they don't brush their teeth and all of that. So I mean, would it have gotten attention? Would it have allowed us to reach lots of people? Would we have gotten the most votes ever? I would argue probably yes. Would it also have led us to having to explain that for generations? Almost certainly. And that's why the delegates didn't choose him, but they did choose me. They chose Joe for president, but then they chose me for vice president. So to answer your question, where can people reach me? I am on Facebook, I'm on YouTube, I'm on Instagram, and I'm on Twitter. I'm on TikTok for the kids, and I'm at literally Spike Cohen on all of those except for Twitter, where that's too long of a handle. So I'm at real Spike Cohen. My website is spikecohen.com, and the website for my nonprofit, You Are the Power. We're an organization that works to help people and spread the liberty message. The website for that is youarethepower.net. And yeah, man, I'm glad that I got to come on and talk about a bunch of stuff we disagree with and spend a few minutes talking about a couple things we did agree with.
I'm happy you came on. Hopefully we can talk again in the future. You have a nice week, man. You have a good one, okay?
I appreciate that. Thank you, Dylan.
Have a good one. Bye-bye.
Thanks, man.